In February each year, world leaders, military chiefs, and CEOs gather in Germany for the Munich Security Conference. Since 1963, decision makers have been coming to Munich to debate urgent defense and foreign policy concerns. Due to the coronavirus pandemic, this year's conference was held virtually. German diplomat Wolfgang Ischinger is the chairman of the Munich Security Conference. He spoke to TRT about the security challenges facing the world in 2021.
Ambassador Ischinger, thank you for joining us.
Hello, good morning.
You took over as chairman of the Munich Security Conference in 2008, and since then the MSC has become widely known as the Davos of foreign policy and security issues. This year, of course, it was like so many other events, it was held virtually, yet you still managed to feature a very impressive lineup, not the least, of course, US President Biden's first address to a European audience and what was likely Angela Merkel's last address at the MSC as German Chancellor. What stood out for you? What was your personal highlight?
Well, I think the event depended largely on the question whether it was going to be possible to get the new US president to participate. All the other participants, Ursula von der Leyen, Emmanuel Macron, Angela Merkel, we've heard them speak many times, but this was really the challenge. Could we get Joe Biden to address Europe, to address a essentially European audience a month after his inauguration? And would he be willing to do this via the platform of the Munich Security Conference? He could have chosen, as far as I'm concerned, he could have chosen, the European Parliament in Brussels or in Strasbourg, or a NATO assembly or some other forum. So we were, of course, doing quite a bit of lobbying beginning way before the inauguration in November, early December. And I think what helped us, of course, was the fact that Joe Biden knew the Munich Security Conference better than anyone else. His first participation, believe it or not, Ali, his first participation was in 1980. This is when most Germans were not even born. And he's been coming back regularly ever since. So this was a familiar territory for him. And having secured his participation, then you can imagine it was very easy to get the others to be included. Boris Johnson, Emmanuel Macron, the leaders of the European Union, Charles Michel, president of the Council, and of course my own Chancellor, Angela Merkel. But Biden was really the star and the key and the necessary key ingredient to this event, obviously.
And his participation is certainly also largely due to the fact that you and President Biden know each other well. Your relationship dates back all the way to your days as German ambassador to the United States. Now, of course, he had a very hopeful message that he conveyed, namely, America is back, which is, of course, the quite opposite of America first. How do you evaluate that statement in light of the fact that 75 million Americans still voted for Donald Trump and that this process could be easily reversed 4 years from now?
Exactly. You're hitting exactly the right button. So when Joe Biden says America is back, that means America is back participating in a positive way with Europeans in Europe and in global affairs in the multilateralist sense of the word. And that is, of course, a very different approach compared to that of his predecessor, Donald Trump. But we should not interpret this sentence, America is back, as meaning that, we will return to quote unquote this perfect transatlantic world of the past. I think there is no way back to the world of the past because, as you just said yourself, there is, of course, now this lingering doubt. If we rely now fully on Joe Biden, to what extent can we rely that there will not be, either in 4 years or in 8 years, another kind of Donald Trump type figure leading the United States, recreating the same problems that we had to suffer through for the last 4 years. So, in other words, connected to the America is now fortunately back working with us in Europe, there is this imperative, this necessary key ingredient to policies conducted by European leaders, policies conducted by the European Union itself. Namely, we need to do more in order to be able to stand on our own 2 feet, so to speak, taking our future, our fate, more into our own hands than simply relying on the fact that a continent away, somebody will forever take care of the security needs of Europe. So that is what makes the future different from the past.
And standing on its own feet, as far as Europe is concerned, is of course something that particularly the French president, Macron, is bringing up numerous times, as he did at the MSCs, talking about strategic autonomy, to be less reliant, to be less dependent on the United States. Do you think Europe has the capacity, or perhaps more importantly, the will to be strategically autonomous?
Well, first of all, my answer would be we have to. This is not, a simple choice. Do we prefer this or do we prefer that? We've got to do more to secure our own future, given the fact that we see more and more great power rivalries emerging. We see a very different behavior by China compared to where China was 10 years ago. We see a far more aggressive approach by Russia on a number of issues. The idea that Russia is simply a large partner in the East is no longer the possible foundation of our relationship. So Europe has to take things more into our own hands. Is the idea of strategic autonomy the right expression? Well, my own view is, in order to avoid being misunderstood, I would prefer expressing it in a somewhat simpler term. I would simply say, let's build up European capabilities. Let's build up European capabilities to act politically, changing our decision-making system in Brussels. Let's build up our capabilities also in the military arena, where currently the EU, if there were ever a major crisis, the EU would not be capable of defending itself. We don't have the necessary intelligence operations, satellite intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. We depend largely through NATO, of course, on the United States. So doing more to build up our own capabilities is a must. And that's, of course, not going to happen overnight. This will take a strategic approach. But I think this is the right idea, whether you call it autonomy or capabilities, the right idea for the European Union going forward.
And you mentioned both China and Russia, of course, as challenges to Europe, but perhaps even to the international order. Let's talk about China here for a second, and in particular, US-China relations. Many sticking issues between those 2 countries, from trade to Taiwan, Hong Kong, 5G tensions and possible clashes in the South China Sea. The list goes on and on. Many people are even calling this the new Cold War. As someone who's been ambassador throughout the first Cold War in the previous century, do you see similarities?
Not really. I don't like the Cold War comparison that much. What I do like and what I would prefer is the wording which both the United States and the European Union have chosen in recent expressions about the relationship of China. Let me put it in my own words. This is at times a relationship of competition. This is at times, in certain areas, a relationship of cooperation, but this is also, in certain areas, a relationship, of confrontation and of adversarial relationship. This latter component, the adversarial relationship, is of course more pronounced between the United States and China than between Europe and China. Why? Because we in Europe, we do not have military relationships with countries in East Asia. The United States does. They have a military relationship, not only with Japan, but also with Taiwan and with a number of other countries in the region. But in principle, I think we need to base our relationship vis-a-vis China on this idea that we choose as much cooperation as possible. We choose as much adversarial relationship as necessary. And we try to base our relationship on a broad-based idea of competition. Let's compete with China. And let's see whether Europe, whether the West can beat China in certain areas. And I think competition is never a bad idea. So competition, I think, should be the key word, not Cold War.
The US-China relationships certainly are going through some tensions, as do EU-Russia relations, of course. If we're looking at the issues of Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, again, many issues that divide the two nations, or the EU and Russia in particular, in this particular regard. How do you get out of this? How do you improve the relationship between the European Union and Russia?
During the Cold War, which you referred to, Ali, just a minute ago, our approach to the then existing Soviet Union was based on what we call the so-called Harmel Report. Not a very long document, but in one sentence, I can summarize the Harmel Report with this: as much cooperation as possible and as much defense and deterrence as necessary. That was the idea built up in the late 60s, early 70s. And that fundamental double approach, double-pronged approach, has actually served us well through the Cold War and beyond. And I think that is actually not a bad point of departure for dealing with Russia going forward. I do not like those proposals which would build a new wall between the West and Russia. We should reach out to Russians. And there will surely also be a Russia after Putin. And there is a fundamental sympathy, I think, between many hundreds of thousands or millions of Russians and the nations in Central and Western Europe. So let's build on the positive elements of the relationship, and let's not forget the dramatic and tragic and terrible history of the 20th century, including the role of my own country in creating such enormous destruction and the horrors of the Holocaust, etc. But at the same time, as we try to leave the door open to more enhanced relationships with Russia in so many different areas, we also need to be tough in terms of defending our interests. And it is not okay, even if it's now 7 years back, it's not okay for Russia to violate the fundamental norms of the Charter of Paris, which we had agreed in 1990, by simply annexing Crimea and by pretending not to be involved in Eastern Ukraine, and by pretending not to have anything to do with the ongoing troubles in Georgia and elsewhere. So, and I'm not even referring to the Navalny case and to poisonings of other Russian individuals in other countries. So we need to be tough where we need to be tough, but we should always keep the door open. There will be a moment, I am quite sure of that, Ali, when Russia will rediscover that the one border which they have, which is not contested by anyone at all, is their western border. Their relationship with Western Europe is a safe relationship. We don't threaten Russia. We have not threatened Russia. We will not threaten Russia. That's our offer going forward.
And going forward, we must. The Munich Security Conference has, of course, established itself as a forum where all these issues that we've discussed on this show, EU-Russia relations, China-US relations, are intensively discussed by leaders from all around the world. And when it comes to global challenges, perhaps none is more pertinent at this particular point anyway than the pandemic. Of course, you had Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the WHO, speaking at this year's Munich Security Conference. And when the pandemic began, the initial thought was, well, this is a common challenge. We're all in the same boat. The pandemic will bring nations and people together. But if we look closer, quite the opposite has happened, hasn't it? Vaccine nationalism being just one aspect of many of the nation-first attitude that has been displayed throughout this globe. Would you concur that we've seen rather a lack of international cooperation during this pandemic?
We've not, looking back over this last year, we have not had a perfect track record. You're absolutely right. Many mistakes have been made. Some leaders thought that returning to a kind of national or even nationalistic approach would take them out of this pandemic more quickly. But the fundamental sentence which Dr. Tedros of WHO expressed almost a year ago remains absolutely central and valid. Namely, he said, if I recall correctly, we will only be safe once everybody is safe. This virus will only be exterminated once it's exterminated everywhere. And this is why I think at the end of the day of this pandemic, the idea of multilateralism, the idea of international cooperation and coordination will win the day. People and leaders and governments and parliaments will rediscover that if they made a mistake in 2020 or in early 2021, they have now learned again that working together, coordinating closely, taking internationalist approaches, preferring internationalist multilateral approaches to national solutions is the better way forward. So I think at the end of this pandemic, we will be, those of us who believe in international action and in multilateralist approaches, will see a stronger Europe and hopefully also a stronger world with a stronger United Nations in the center of it, with the WHO given stronger executive powers and more resources, which is what they desperately need. Because the next pandemic, as Bill Gates said during our event in February, the next pandemic is certain to come. We don't know when, we don't know how, but it's going to happen, and we should be prepared for that.
Multilateralism and international cooperation are indispensable, says Ambassador Ischinger, to battle this pandemic and beyond, of course. Another issue where international cooperation is without any alternative is climate change, of course. You had US President Climate Envoy John Kerry speaking at the Munich Security Conference. And you speak to many of the world leaders throughout the year, not just at the MSC. Do you get the sense that the problem of climate change is sufficiently being understood and recognized as a security threat in foreign policy circles?
Well, that was certainly not sufficiently the case up until quite recently. I would I would have been worried if you had asked me this question a year or two or three ago. Looking at the situation now in 2021, I think it has now become clear to almost all leaders, including in China, including in Russia, in India, and everywhere else, that the climate security nexus is of great strategic importance, and that climate is not simply, an issue in Germany for the Greens, for the climate advocates, but it is a matter of high priority for all those, including myself, who think in terms of national, European, and global security. I think that this is now more or less accepted. And I'm glad to say that when I look at our own events going forward, I will have no problem in inviting senior speakers from around the world, leaders, prime ministers, presidents, to talk about climate security. That would have not been the case a few years ago, but I think the world has grown up and is now mature enough to understand this is, next to the pandemic, the key challenge going forward into the next decade of the 21st century.
So the awareness that climate change and dealing with climate change is essential for our own security is growing, says Ambassador Ischinger. There's a conventional wisdom out there that these are dangerous times that we live in. And if you look around the numerous conflicts, Syria, of course, 10 years on, Yemen, Mali, Libya, many conflicts are threatening the stability and security of the globe. Particularly also perhaps during the times where diplomacy in times of a pandemic cannot be conducted in person. Face-to-face meetings are not possible at this particular point, of course, evident by this conversation that we're having at this particular time. As an experienced diplomat and chairman of the Munich Security Conference, how concerned are you, or rather how optimistic are you looking into the future that human mankind will prevail in light of the many looming challenges and conflicts that we're experiencing and seeing right now?
Well, Ali, if you are, as I am, a trained professional diplomat, you've got to be an optimist. You cannot be a successful diplomat without believing in progress, without believing that things can be done if the time is right, the political will is there, etc. So I tend to be rather optimistic, but the question to what extent we can use our collective resources better than we have been able to do so in the past is a question of the international community coming together. Why has it been the case for many years now that the Security Council of the United Nations, for example, has been largely inefficient, has been blocked from being able to take the necessary decisions to stop, let's say, the conflict in Libya, or to end this decade-long war in Syria and elsewhere? Well, what is the reason? The reason is that governments, especially the great powers, do not agree. There is the veto role, which a small number, 5 countries have, and I would hope that the use of the veto will decline in years to come. That is what Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, complains about. We do not use the institutional arrangements which have been created after World War II on the ruins of the devastation of World War II, we do not make the best use of these institutions. The same is true inside the European Union. We in the European Union, when we look at major challenges, we are sometimes incapable of reaching meaningful decisions because one member or two members of the EU disagree and cast their veto. We have the use of the veto in foreign policy also, which makes us sometimes extremely inefficient. So both at the global level and at the European level, my wish would be that we should limit the use of the veto. We should actually exterminate the veto. That will be practically not entirely possible, I'm afraid. But we should encourage our own leaders to work together and to be willing to compromise more, to find solutions to end conflicts, to manage conflicts, and to prevent even their beginning. That is the original purpose of the Security Council of the United Nations. Sadly, it has not worked well for many years now. That needs to change. Let's get together, let's do it. And I think Joe Biden, when he spoke at our event a few weeks ago, expressed this optimism. America is back. Well, let's all be back now and try to create a more cooperative, a more capable international system that tackles not only the pandemic, but all these other unresolved issues more successfully than in the past. The time is now.
The time is now, says the chairman of the Munich Security Conference, Ambassador Ischinger, by definition, by default, as a diplomat, optimistic despite the many challenges that the globe is currently facing. Thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you, Ali. Very good. Thank you very much.